Very good. We have about half an hour or so for questions. So while you're thinking, let me just ask one question on the big theme of inequality, which to me personally is really the most serious problem. A lot of economists wonder whether India will go through the sort of Kuznets curve phenomenon. This, as many of you would know, is the Kuznets curve postulates that when countries initially take off, inequality gets worse, and then as growth becomes more broad-based, the inequality declines. And it's a theory out there which says that India is on the first leg of the curve, or on the rising part, and as time goes on, the growth will trickle down and inequality will get less and less. I'm personally not persuaded yet, because I think there's a lot of marginalized communities in India. There's scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, Muslims, various, even gender inequality. There's regional inequality as well. Per capita incomes in Bihar and UP are 1/3 to 1/4 what they are in the southern states. So with all these, it's very hard to see how growth can become broad-based. But I just want the panel's response. James, Vinod, or Medha, if you have a response to how do you see the inequality story evolving over the next 20 years? The first 20 years have been pretty bad.
When I was writing the book, which I wrote in Newtown, sitting often in the Starbucks in Newtown, I spent a few sort of afternoons with my head in my hands trying to get to grips with the literature on the Kuznets curve. The gist of which is that people don't really think that this holds as a kind of theoretical relationship, or at least that was the sense I got out of it anymore. That there is some countries have followed that pattern, but there's nothing necessary in the process of development which means that inequality will first rise and then fall, even though that sounds somewhat persuasive from, I don't know, the history of Sweden or something like that. I suppose my sense is the risk is that India's levels of inequality are quite likely to keep rising because it's at such an early stage in its industrialization, and the kind of forces that have been at play over the last 10 or 20 years are only going to get stronger. I mean, you should see the creation of a much larger middle class over the next sort of 20, 30 years. But nonetheless, it seems fairly clear that the kind of proceeds of growth in India are going overwhelmingly to the top 10%, in a sense to the sort of people in this room would recognize as middle class. And some of those are benefiting from the integration of India's economy within the global system. I mean, the one thing to say about inequality is that sort of these guys don't figure in any of this data because you can't get billionaires and sort of people who have tons of cash don't turn up in any of the surveys. There are just too few of them to measure. So you're really talking about, the top 5%, I guess, is the one sort of showing up in most of the surveys. And these people have done reasonably well over they're the people in the top 10% of the graph who've done relatively better than everybody else. And so those are people living in Mumbai or Delhi or Bangalore who work for international organizations who have typically white-collar jobs in the services sector. They benefit as the country urbanizes, and all of these forces are going to continue. So if you look at what happened in East Asia to give a more inclusive model of development, for a start you had well-functioning states which were able to make sure that rich people paid a fair share of taxes and were sort of socially responsible in other ways. But you also had states with high capacity that were able to build basic systems of K through 12 education, basic health services, systems of social insurance that are important in kind of keeping the gap between the bottom and the top at a reasonable level. And I think the risk is that on current path, few of these things are going to happen in India. Now, that's not to suggest that this is a sort of set in stone. But in order to reverse what seems to be a fairly clear trend towards inequality of different sorts is going to take some fairly substantial policy reforms. In this regard, I have to say, I rather admire Mr. Modi for his recent measures on healthcare. I mean, I think reasonable people can disagree about the model that he has chosen, and certainly the fact that Modi Care, as they call it, doesn't have any primary care in it and is heavily skewed towards a private sector system of insurance. Both of those things are risky in the sense that most of the other good quality systems of mass national healthcare do not work on those lines. They tend to have a larger state component and they tend to have a focus on primary care. Nonetheless, the ambition of that program, I think, is terrific, because in a sense that's what it's going to take in health and education, pensions, the development of human capital, the revitalization of India's state-owned enterprises. Across all of these areas where you need substantial reforms, you sort of need measures of this size and scale if you're going to stop an issue like inequality running out of control. And I think the bit of the Kuznets curve which does work is the beginning bit. It does seem clear that the inequality tends to rise in the early stages of industrialization. The problem is if you get a country like Brazil, South Africa, when it goes up and it never comes back under control. I mean, to some degree that's true in the US as well, where the US has had historically high levels of inequality and has never really been able to kind of wrestle it back under control. And that's the risk for India, in a sense that if you let the toothpaste out of this tube, then it's very hard to get it back in.
Any other thoughts?
Vikram, I would look at it like this. Yes, Kuznets curve, that's been the traditional, that's been the conventional pattern as is followed. On the other side, you would be worried about what I think you referred to also, the Gini coefficient, where the equality levels have been magnified. But yes, with growth, inequality has come about. There's no doubt about it. Inequality has become sharp, but I wouldn't, while it's a cause for concern, I wouldn't get too alarmed by it, to the extent that if the absolute levels of poverty or absolute levels of income continue to grow, because the moment you start trying to bring about sustainability and equality and match it with economic growth, you will have a slowing down of economic growth itself. Now, whether that's a pattern that the government would want to adopt is a point of debate. Because I would sincerely feel that with the measures taken over the last 10 years, this government and the government previously, subsidies being, inequalities will lessen if India can put its rural sector into the middle space, growth space, where the agriculture sector is also developing at least 5% per annum. Now, the governments have tried to bring about targeted subsidies. Introduction of the direct benefit system, as it's called, has ensured that leakages in the system have reduced tremendously. The other is that the Rural Employment Guarantee Program, through targeted subsidy, targeted delivery of the wages, is also ensuring that there's no leakage. So it's actually going to the beneficiary itself. Now, if you visit rural areas of India today, you will find that there is a substantial amount of purchasing power available with them. Whether it's coming from government schemes, I really can't say. Because normally what happens is these were migrant labor which used to move either towards textile manufacturing or those kind of sectors, or to harvesting and sowing in Punjab and Haryana kind, Maharashtra areas, or but now they are not able to move because those sectors themselves are getting have been stymied over the last 3 to 5 years. So they are staying back, but the governmental schemes have been able to, in some measure, supplement their incomes. So to that extent, I would feel that inequality levels will be in check. I'm not saying that they will reduce substantially, but will certainly be under check.
Medha, any?
I think I would agree with what Mr. Rai says. But to add to that, that the state needs to keep on its regulatory hat. And that is what will be most important in dealing with inequality. So state measures, etc., need to continue in the way that they have been doing. The state must not give up. And inequality in many ways is also a problem of governance. It's a problem of the state not, doing its role in terms of distribution.
Right. No, but just a brief follow-up on that. I mean, I think we accept that there will be inequality of outcomes, but future inequality depends on the inequality of opportunity.
Yeah.
Now, how severe are these? If these are still very severe, I don't think we can be optimistic about the reducing inequality of outcomes.
Yeah, but I think it's changing.
It's changing?
And it doesn't worry me it upsets me but doesn't worry me.
Would you be talking about inequality? You talked about marginalization.
Yes.
And opportunity that you're talking about, is it economic opportunity or is it?
Well, opportunity is, in a broad sense, it's opportunity, access to resources, access to decision makers, access. It's a very broad issue.
I would sincerely feel, and there are lots of people who have handled the administrative system in the country today. It will be very unfair to say there is inequality in access to governmental resources or facilities or any of the schemes that the government is putting out. I think that will be very unfair. Because the marginalization that you're talking about has nothing to do with marginalization of religions or marginalizations of scheduled castes and scheduled. Marginalization is probably to some extent because of the inaccessible areas and areas which have not been gainers in the process of development.
It's a sort of interesting question, this, isn't it? I mean, I speak from a position of some weakness, given I'm a Brit, right? And so we have a class system and all sorts of problems with ladders of equality and inequality. But I suppose it always struck me, I think what you're getting at is something that I rather agree with, that one of the problems that India has is that it has some ladders of opportunity and advancement which work tremendously well, but only for a fairly small number of people, which is if you're very good at maths, then you can kind of zip your way through this. If you think of this like a kind of game of snakes and ladders, then there's one ladder that works really well, which is you get into IIT and you get an engineering degree and, Zoom, off you go. You get a job at Tata and, you're made, get a job in the IIS. But compared to other countries, particularly around East Asia, not even talking about the vast industrialized economies, the problem is that the ladders of opportunity for the kind of broad mass of people in the country do not work like that. So Rajiv Lal, he was here, the chief executive of IDFC Bank, was here last week, and he made the point that, in a sense, one of the problems of the Indian education system, and again, this is getting us off the topic of the book, is that people are given just enough education to know what a good life looks like, but not quite enough to get one. And that this is the sort of the great challenge that Modi is facing, which is that you have, the kind of mythic figure of 10 to 12 million people entering the labor market every year. These are people, it's not like China, when China began to industrialize in the 1980s, when, the Chinese could just tell people what to do and no one had smartphones. This is a democracy where people have a sense of their own rights and they have access to Mr. Ambani's, fast 4G, so they know what the life they want is. But most people, except those who go up that particularly kind of miraculous ladder, if you're lucky enough to be born with a kind of brilliant mind, struggle to find a system which helps them advance. I think that's what you're kind of driving at. And that, I think, is a big challenge, that in a sense India has enormous talents in its people. I mean, you see that in the diaspora wherever you go. Sort of Indians do wonderfully well in every country in the world that they arrive in. But in India, the kind of the government and the systems that the government produces kind of lets down its people, whether that's the education system or outside of disease prevention, urban governance. There's a whole range of different problems which mean that kind of those ladders of social advancement are not there to the extent that they should be. Anyway,
well, there are many eminent people in the audience, and it'll be.
One question I would like to ask you: what do you think is the solution to this issue? Does the solution lie in a welfare state where subsidies are being targeted at people, like you're talking about the Modi Care and all that? Or do you think the solution lies in spending money on developing the basic infrastructure? In fact, there's a lot of criticism of Modi care saying instead of spending money on targeting subsidies, that money can be better utilized by spending it on developing the basic infrastructures like the hospitals or the schools or whatever. So where do you think, what do you think is the better model?
I mean, I don't think there's a simple answer to this. So often you hear people say, in a sense you hear this in Singapore still, this sort of notion of the fear of suddenly slipping into some kind of European sense of welfare dependency. We can't afford to do this at this level of our GDP. So still in Singapore you have a kind of anxiety about an excessively large state. And in India, fair enough, with the tax base that India has, there's a limited amount that you can spend. Nonetheless, what I took out of learning about the East Asian development model was that most of the states of East Asia, what are you trying to do in these moments? You're trying to take a mass of uneducated people who used to work on farms and get them ready to work in basic factories, either to go and work on factory lines or, Vodafone stores, whatever it might be, sort of some basic entry-level position in either the manufacturing or services sector, hopefully manufacturing, because that's it's the easiest to kind of skill people through, but if not that, then basic services. And to do that, typically you need to spend government money. So you're not talking about laying on a kind of lavish German-style healthcare system that is completely unsuited for your level of economic development. But these things tend not to be either or. I mean, countries that are successful tend to, they create well-run markets in which resources are sort of, divided up by the market as you would hope, but they also create frugal but effective states, high-capacity states, which begin to build systems of social support. So you can call that a welfare state if you like. So yeah, I think some portion of India's future does involve building a welfare state, and it can't build one that is massively beyond its means. But the notion that India can become a middle-income country simply by building roads and not looking after its people, not providing healthcare to people who get sick, or good education for the mass of people as opposed to simply those who are smart enough to kind of whisk their way into IITs. I think that's a mistake, and I think that would be to learn the wrong lessons of sort of Asian development in general. So I'd be interested. So the gentleman who asked the question runs State Bank of India here, so I'd be interested to know your views on the state of the banking system as well.
We'll get into that. Yes, I think the lady here. Sorry.
Well, you have the microphone in your hand. But you're just going to have to shout.
Yes. Ronnie Mullen, I'm a visiting research scholar here at ISIS. I would like to perhaps challenge you and be provocative and ask you what is really new about your book. I say this because Indian professor Mazumdar a few years ago said 15 of India's 25 largest business houses were the same business houses in 1969. And as laid out by a historian we have here on the panel, Professor Kudaisya, India had similar issues. Some of the same names that you mentioned, the Birlas, are still around, right? So is there anything new about the Billionaire Raj that you talk about in your book, or is it a question of scale? Has it just, we're just seeing billionaires instead of millionaires, but it's the same name, it's the same people, it's much of the same. I'm just not sure whether this is an entirely new phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's quite a rich question, so thank you for that. I mean, so this is spectacularly new. The creation of a kind of Indian upper strata with global quantities of wealth is absolutely a phenomenon of the last 15 years, I mean, to some degree since 1991. But I mean, so if you think about the condition that India found itself as it emerged out of socialism, it was actually, it was unequal in many ways that you as an audience who know South Asia well will be familiar with, sort of the legacy of colonialism and feudalism and the caste system and yada, yada, yada. But in terms of wealth and inequality, India was quite an egalitarian place in which its business elite sort of was relatively conservative, had a certain aesthetic even, believed in a kind of Congress-era movement of national liberation and so forth. This was not the business elite of Vijay Mallya and Gautam Adani and people like that. And so not simply the quantity of wealth that has been created by these people in the last 10 or 15 years, which is just out of all proportion from what there was before, but in a sense the ethic of these business leaders is completely different from the kind of the Bombay Plan sort of image that would have been dominant in the during the license Raj. Now it is fair to say that there has been some kind of continuity. You still have Tata and Birla. It was interesting that I didn't know the story about Mr. Ramkrishna Dalmia, but actually one of his ancestors, Gaurav Dalmia, who's one of the sort of scions of the Dalmia group now, threw me a party in Delhi for the book when it came out, so I'm very grateful to the Dalmia group. So you still see the kind of echoes of this, and above all, although not in the sense that you were talking about, but in the relatively recent sense, you have the name Ambani. And so even as all of this tumult has come across India over the last 15 years, always at the top of the billionaire list, you have had the name Ambani I think there was 1 year in which Lakshmi Mittal sort of poked his head above the parapet. But typically you've had this sort of continuity at the top. But actually underneath, if you look at the structure of the Indian listed sector, so if you look at the composition of the Sensex, it's actually it's one of the reasons to be optimistic about India. It has a kind of very peculiar looking stock market for an emerging industrialized economy. So if you look at Brazil, Russia, China's a weird case because much of the wealth in the country isn't in the listed sector anyway. But these other countries have much more, they're much less diverse in the nature of their corporate sector. So Brazil is dominated by commodities exporters, for instance. India actually has a very diverse corporate sector, and in a sense it reflects this distinction that I talk about in the book between the good and the bad billionaires, between what some Michael Walton at Harvard has called the rent-thick and rent-thin sectors of the economy, those like IT outsourcing and generic pharmaceuticals, which you mentioned, which broadly speaking have had far fewer problems of governance and corruption than those in rent-thick sectors like mining and heavy industries and power, property in particular, infrastructure development. But so the kind of Sensex or the Nifty, it's quite diversified, and it changes quite often. So if you were to look at the leading lights of that index 10 or 20 years ago, actually you'd find a lot of churn. So although you still have the Tata Group, I don't know, you have groups like, think about Bombay Dyeing, something like that, a real leading light of corporate India, which sort of sank. Look at what's happening to even Anil Ambani at the moment. So I wrote a column which I sort of made the point that I thought that what was happening to Mr. Anil Ambani was actually a rather good thing for India, because it showed that even somebody who had a great family name and who was known for having excellent political connections, in a sense, if he ran his businesses very badly, there was no saving him. So he's sort of screwed up his businesses, particularly his telecoms business, and now he's going to become, I'm sure he'll still have a few billion to run together. But so in a sense, this is a reason to be optimistic about India, which is that there is diversification in the corporate sector. It's not a kind of commodities exporter. It's not a crony capitalist system like Russia. It has these sectors that are world-class and competitive, and it has these sectors that are more enmeshed in government and have more problems. And there is a lot of churn. But I think what's happening is completely new and a function of the kind of global era in which India has found itself. It's very different from the kind of world that you were talking about. So.
quick comment. Do you want to add anything? Since you
No, I think you're right. I think the scale is different. The flamboyant characters are more center stage than they were earlier. Dalmia was not, could not be center stage after the late 1950s. So that is really what the difference is. Maybe it's more flamboyant, but so is the
qualitatively
middle
there's
class
no-
more flamboyant.
Okay.
And crony capitalism has always been there.
This is definitely that, yeah. Yes, the gentleman here. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two questions. I'm from the ASEAN Study Center next door. The first question, since you mentioned the French fighter jet deals, the first question is about the role of the Indian military in crony capitalism and corruption, whether they have any significant role. At least we don't see them have any significant role in national politics, unlike in Pakistan, Myanmar, or my country, Thailand. So the first question is, Indian military, what is their role in supporting the crony capitalism, whether there is a serious relationship with politics? Second question is, we in ASEAN have the impression that politicians from India tend to be more open when they come to talk about free trade. But when senior Indian officials come to negotiate, they tend to be very protectionist. And that's why our free trade negotiation with India always very slow going. So my question is whether the bureaucrat, maybe Mr. Vinod can share with us, whether the bureaucrats in India have their own special relationship with big business to support their crony capitalism.
Not this bureaucrat's honest. So. Yeah, the first one's a fascinating question. So if you were to compare the Indian military to Pakistan or Myanmar or I mean even Sri Lanka under the Rajapaksas, where in a sense the military became a kind of industrial complex of its own and the military was owning large productive facilities, typically India does not have this problem. There's a much more healthy relationship between the kind of civilian leadership and the military in India, and I had never come across the notion that, I don't know, the military were owning steel plants or whatever it might be, which is sort of true. As soon as you go to Pakistan, you hear that the military controls half of the industrial economy. But since the Bofors scandal in the 80s to the fighter jet scandal today, I mean, the standing assumption is that military procurement is incredibly corrupt. And in ways that wasn't something I touched on in the book. It's not a kind of background. I never really covered the defense industry. And there wasn't a huge defense scandal at the time that I happened to be reporting on it. But you know, particularly we talked about this, and I talk about it in the book, the phenomenon of kind of middlemen and intermediaries as enablers of crony capitalism. And this is an absolute classic in procurement, and that seems to have been what's happening in this case of the fighter jets as well, that you have lots of different intermediaries kind of going around and trying to act between the politicians and the purchasers and the equipment suppliers. And anyway, so as far as I've always understood it, there's enormous problems of kind of cronyism and siphoning off money in military procurement. That's not unique to India by any means, but in a sense, it doesn't have the more deep-rooted problems of military involvement in economic life that characterize some other countries around the region. And I'll leave the question about the bureaucrats to Vinod.
Just a small bit on the military. I can say for the fact that the Indian military establishment is totally bereft of anything political, number one, political ambitions. After retirement, X or Y may contest elections. That's an entirely different thing. But the military establishment is totally separate from anything which is political or free of cronyism. Even if there are allegations in procurement, it's not the military which is involved. And as James said, typically military procurements worldwide are big-ticket procurements. And I think worldwide there's a phenomenon of a lobbyist or an agent or somebody being associated with those procurements. But the Indian military, at least, is free of those aspects of it. As far as the officials are concerned, I can assure you one thing, that even if an official I'm not denying the fact that he may owe allegiance to a business house. May, I'm not here to give a testimonial to bureaucrats. But if he comes to negotiate a trade agreement, believe me, he comes with a written brief which is cleared by the political executive. So it's not that he's crossing the T or dotting the I by himself, or there are slants in which he's helping X or Y of his own accord. So there's absolutely, so whatever the politician says, a politician on a platform says 100 things. And he may not mean 99 of those. I've had a prime minister who said that, look, I look at 100 files every day, and if a wrong recommendation comes to me, how do I figure it out for myself? I've had a chief minister who said that, look, I sign 100 files again every day. Well, I may have signed something wrong, so what? So to that extent, as far as the bureaucrats are concerned, to these negotiations, in these multilateral negotiations, there's certainly no inroad of any business house to which he owes allegiance.
Sorry. Just on the ASEAN-India issue, I mean, the key problem from India's point of view is services. That, it's fine to open up goods trade. I mean, that would tend to benefit ASEAN, but India's comparative advantage lies in services, and they would like to see more freedom of movement of natural persons, of visas and rights of residence, etc. So these are in India's interests. So in this respect, India may be unique in that it has this particular comparative advantage in a very large sense, which other ASEAN countries do not. So India does come across as being relatively protectionist on trade, but there is this issue that needs to be resolved. So, yes, sir.
My name is Sunil. I demonetization happened just before UP election.
Someone always asks about demonetization.
Did you get a feel at any time that this was also to help billionaires to go more corruption?
So, I mean, I talk about demonetization. It's a good point to end on because everyone disagrees about demonetization, and so if you get the last word on this, you can kind of leave it hanging, and then everyone can disagree with you. So, one of the chapters in the book, I start out with the announcement on demonetization. I imagine everyone in the room knows what this was when Modi took all of the banknotes out of circulation. So there was all sorts of rumors flying around about why Modi did this. One of which was a kind of speculation about the upcoming UP elections, which was that if you suddenly removed all of this money, then politicians who had sort of stacks of cash sitting around from rival parties would be damaged. I mean, I think that's a little bit cynical. I never really believed that. I mean, in a sense, I think I think demonetization was a disaster, complete disaster. Almost no redeeming features, and to the extent that it did, they were super tiny next to the nature of the damage that was done. If you look at it, knocked 30, 40 basis points off GDP for 2 quarters, which is kind of what a natural disaster looks like. If you have a tsunami, that's what it looks like. And so it was a sort of self-inflicted wound of the scale of a natural disaster, with some ancillary benefits in terms of nudging a few people into doing online payments and that sort of thing, but nothing compared to the crime. But I mean, I suppose I tend to think that when Modi thought this was going to work, that he had some slightly crackpot advisors who he happened to have been listening to, and I don't think that he did it as an act of incredibly cynical political manipulation, nor do I think that he did it as an act of kind of gross populism, although there was an element of that in the way that it was framed. I mean, I think that for good or ill, he was just sort of poorly advised and thought that this would actually be an effective means of combating corruption and sort of ritually cleansing the Indian system. And he was wrong about that. But I don't, in a sense, think that he was that either, that he was that sort of electorally cynical, or that he introduced it as a kind of form of cynical populism. I think it was just, terribly bad economic policy, proposed by people who didn't know very much about economics. And it didn't do India any good at all, but one can now move beyond it, I hope. So,
Very good.
thank you very much for coming.
That's it. We're out of time, but it's been a fascinating session, and thank you all. Thank you, James. Thank you, Vinod. Thank you, Professor Kudaisya. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, great. There we go.
Very interesting.
Thanks.
Very interesting.
But a lot of
Thank you, Mr. Khanna and distinguished panelists. With that, we have come to the end of the ISAS panel discussion. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in future ISAS events. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Okay.
Here we are. You have a copy?